Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to train on installing, configuring and creating new zones in the DNS server in a Windows environment. So this is how to set up a Windows server with DNS. This can be both internal and external facing, and how to create zones and domain names and how to get it all working. So this is valid for pretty much all the recent Windows servers environments. This is the same process in Windows Server 2012, 2016 and 2019. Today we are going to actually show it on Windows Server 2019, but it's actually the same process in across all the servers. So without further ado, let's start. So I've earlier created a Windows Server 2019. We'll just confirm that this is Server 2019. Windows Server 2019 Data Center. This is Data Center Edition, but it doesn't really matter. Any edition, it could be any edition, and it's the same process. Data Center Edition just got some additional functions not related with Windows DNS Server. Okay, to install the server, what we need to do is go into Server Manager first. So we will launch the Server Manager. We can just ignore message like this particular message, and we click on Add Roles and Features. We click Next. We leave that at the same radio button where it is, role based, and we click Next. Under server selection, we select the server if there's multiple servers. In this instance, there's only a single server, dev01, and that will be named whatever is named. That name will be whatever the server name is on the server that you're installing it on. And we click Next. Under server roles, this is where it's going to be installed. So we have server roles and we have server features. Features are functionality such as BitLocker and other items, but we are interested in server roles. Server roles will be roles such as Active Directory, such as DNS server, which is what we're going to be interested in, and other servers, which will be, and all these will be covered in other videos. Today we are only concerned with Windows DNS server. So we click this radio button on this, and it comes back that which roles you want to add, and it just confirms the roles. We want to add all of those, so you just click Add Feature. This is fine. This is a validation process because it's an internal server on the server, so we can just ignore that and press Continue. It's because the reason why this message is coming is because it's a Windows server which is not set up in a way it should be on a network. But you can ignore this on this instance. You wouldn't normally get this because you'll have a static IP address assigned, which does not change. So we will continue with this. We click Next. If there was other features you wanted to add at the same time, we could add those in now, but because we only want to add this particular DNS server only, so we will click Next, and we click Next on the features. Because we've added this feature in now, DNS server, we want to click Next on this. Just to highlight some of the points highlighted there. If you're installing Active Directory, then all it's saying that is that with Active Directory, Windows DNS Server is part of it. So if you're going to install Active Directory, Windows DNS Server will automatically installed anyway. You don't need to specifically select it because Windows Active Directory needs it. so it will install it as part of that setup. But if you install it beforehand and install Active Directory later, that is absolutely fine, and there's no issues with doing that. So if you've already got a DNS server installed, you can install an Active Directory on top of that. That is absolutely fine. We can continue from here and press next at this stage. This now gives you because installing the DNS server is going to restart the server potentially. So what it's saying that is, can the server be restarted automatically once the DNS server is installed? I normally click yes, because I think it's a good idea to give it a reboot anyway. However, if it's a production service that you're working on, then absolutely you need to raise the requested changes and follow your change process. Absolutely. But if you're installing a DNS server, you probably would have you should actually select some downtime while you're raising any changes for this to happen. I will click yes on this because we want to restart the server, and you click install. Upon installation, the server should not need to be restarted, but I will give it a restart anyway because that's what I choose to do. But I don't think it needs to be restarted as such. So we will click install. That will now install the DNS server feature. I won't put the video on hold because it shouldn't take too long. In the meantime, I'll just tell you more about the DNS server and the zones. So the DNS server, the purpose of which is, as well as for Active Directory, it's a name to IP address translation feature. And this feature is a server feature. So once it's installed, you can actually create the zones. You can also set the DNS server to pick up external DNS entries. So for example, if you wanted to look up news.bbc.co.uk, for example, you could actually the server will actually go and look that up. So if you're pointing to this DNS server, all your servers, all your workstations, that is absolutely fine as long as you put the correct DNS entries in and configure it correctly. It will go and query external DNS names, but that's if you want to configure it that way. If you do not want to configure it that way, that is fine. We will come back to that in a bit. The DNS server is now installed. We click close, and we can now close the DNS feature, the server manager, because that feature is now installed and it's there. So we can close this. Now what we need to do is go into Control Panel and launch the DNS console, the management console. So we go into Control Panel, and from there we go into Administration Tools, and there's the DNS server. Now that would not have been there earlier on before we installed it. As soon as you install a service feature, it becomes available in this section, and you can launch it from here. So just double click on it, and that will launch the DNS server. Now this DNS server, you can actually configure it. So you can configure DNS server, and you can say configure it if you want to create forward lookup zones, create forward lookup, reverse lookup zones, and configure route hints. So the route hints, we'll start with that, are for external lookup. So if you want to you want your DNS server to be able to look up external zones, i.e. you want to look up external domain names, then you can set it up and configure it so it points to the route hints, which will then be fully accessible from the inside. We'll be able to query the external internet for domain name lookup. So effectively what it means is you can put this on your network, this DNS server, and this will can act as the primary DNS server for your network, and that will be done by configuring the DNS zones root hints. So we click next on that, and now the root hints are there. So these are all the root hints that are required for the internet. In addition, you can add other root hints in yourself manually. So for example, you might have this might be an edge router, a server, or you might have another DNS server already on the network, and this is pointing to a specific network which is within a separate sort of network, or you're creating another DNS server for another purpose, and this DNS server is limited purpose, but you want to be able to look up the other DNS servers on your network. So in this instance, or actually if you've got another DNS server on a different network, you might have a VPN connection, and there might be another DNS server. For example, it might be another office with its own DNS server, but you want this, and it's a segregated network. So you can, and you got VPN, like site-to-site VPN. In this instance, as long as there's a site-to-site VPN and the routes are accessible, this you can add that server, that root hint in by putting the IP address. So it might be on a different network. So for example, this particular server is on a private network called the IP address of which is 10.0.0.6. So that might be on a different subnet, for example 192.168.1. something. So in this case, you would add that IP address in like this, 192.168.1. Let's say it was on 20. So that's a different subnet. So unless there's a route to get to it, you would not be able to get to it. So for the purpose of this, it's presumed that the route is already configured, or you can check our other videos on configuring routes. But this IP address, presuming that the VPN is already in place and configured and the route is there to get to this other network, then all you're going to do is resolve that, and as long as the DNS server can resolve it. If it cannot resolve it, that is absolutely fine. As long as the IP address is there, you press OK, and that will now be in the list. So it means that any requests for names that you get which are not in the root hints, then it will actually ask this server to look it up, and as long as it's on that server, it will be able to look it up, because this DNS server has now got the root hint to go to this zone, and that's absolutely fine. Another thing that you can do is you can add forwarders in, which is similar to root hints, where you can, if this was on the inside of your network, this DNS server, but there was another DNS server for example on the edge of your network. So this server doesn't directly have access to the internet, but your server on the edge of the network does have access to the internet, because this might be on the internal network. Then you would need to add a forwarder in, so that this DNS server can query the edge DNS server, and that the edge DNS server does not necessarily have to be a Windows DNS server. If that was a Linux-based DNS server, that's absolutely fine, and you can add the root hint in here. Sorry, not root hint, as a forwarder here. In this case, you wouldn't need the root hints. You can delete them all, because it will just forward requests that are not in its zone, which are not already existing in its own zone. It will be able to query out to the other zones. This is event logs. You can say what event logs you'd want to log, or what you don't want to log, and you can just manage that. By default, it's all event logs, and that's absolutely fine. Interface. Now, interface is what interface you want this DNS server to work on. So there might be a reason that you might not want it to work on all interfaces, and that's again absolutely fine, because you might have multiple NICs, and the different NICs might be on might be facing different interfaces. So you might want to limit that for that reason, or the DNS server you want it to work is on a specific IP and you want it to be only on that IP, and that is absolutely so. You can put the DNS server on either on all IP addresses, which means if you had multiple IP addresses, multiple interfaces, so if you have multiple NICs, for example, with different IPs, it would work across all the IPs. It would the DNS server wouldn't look or try to not communicate. If a request comes to it on any interface, it will communicate. But if you say we want it only on a given DNS server, given IP address, so we point that to only the following IP, only the following IP address, and we uncheck the other address. So this is an IPv6 address. Again, we will IPv6 will be discussed in a different in another video. For this video's purposes, we're only interested in IPv4. But if you were talking on IPv6 and you wanted to, you could actually, maybe you wanted to speak to only communicate on IPv6 address. You could uncheck that and check this and apply, and it will only be communicating on this IP. But for our purposes, we only wanted to talk on 10.0.0.6 private IP address range, so we're going to select that. And for your own purposes, this could be a 192 address, it could be a 192.168 address, or 10 dot something like this, or it could be another private IP address range, and they're all fine, absolutely fine. So what we'll do is we'll apply here. So now it will only talk on this IP address. It will not be listening on any other IP address. We press OK. We go right click on there again, and we go into properties, and we've done forwarders. We can add forwarders in. Advanced, we don't need to. You can leave that as is. This should all be default. This load zone on startup. So this is telling the server where you're going to load the zone from. Are you going to, you can load it from Active Directory and registry, or you can say, load it from a file. So if you load it from a file, what it means is that it's going to write it to a file, which is going to physically reside in a file on the DNS server within Windows. And that's absolutely fine. You can do that. You can load it from registry, or you can say anywhere, Active Directory and registry. So if you haven't installed Active Directory and you select this option, that's absolutely fine, because it will try to load it from Active Directory and registry. And obviously Active Directory is not present, but the registry is present, so it will save everything to registry, and that's absolutely fine. But if you wanted to choose from file, then it means it's going to create zone files within a physical file. And the bind server, which is based on Linux, this is pretty much how it works. It's actually based on file, so it creates a file for each zone. And if you wanted to do it this way, that's absolutely fine as well. There's nothing untoward towards it. However, if it's in the registry and you're using Active Directory, then obviously loading from registry from Active Directory is what's required. We will leave it on default because there's no reason for me to change it, and we press apply on that one. Monitoring, we don't need to worry about. Advanced, we've already done. Login, we've already done. So we've done all the basic items, so that's absolutely fine. You can actually use this to connect to another DNS server. If it was another Windows DNS server in your network and you didn't want to log into that, you could actually say connect to a DNS server and choose the following, and put the name of the DNS server For example, if that was a DNS server called dev02, you would type in dev02 and press OK, and it will, obviously if it was there, it will find it and it will connect to it, and that will be absolutely fine. However, because it doesn't exist, dev02, obviously it can't find it, and that was the reason for the error. We press cancel there, and we will now go on to creating zones. To create a zone, you expand. This is the DNS server, so we will close it just so we know, everybody knows how to launch it. And you go into administrative tools, double click on DNS, double click on the actual DNS server, which is the name of the server, expand that. Now here you've got, we will put it onto full screen. Here you've got two types of zones that we are concerned with here today. One's the forward lookup and one is the reverse lookup. Now the difference between the two is forward lookup zone refers to zones which are domain names. So for example, it could be, if you want to look up what a news.bbc.co.uk was, then it's a forward lookup. So if you want to find out an IP address of a domain name, that's a forward lookup. If you wanted to find out from a IP address what the lookup, what the domain name is attached to it, that's a reverse lookup. So if you want to do a reverse lookup, it would be, for example, let's create both the zones and then I will explain how it works. At the moment we don't have any zones, so if I open up a command prompt, so we can do a lookup at the same time. Here we will say NS lookup, and that's actually pointing to an external DNS server at the moment. So we will change that to sorry, I'll give you one way to look up is NS lookup, and if we do that, it will give us the options that we can use. So here we want to change the DNS server, and that is done by doing NS lookup. First we go into NS lookup, and then you say you want to change the server, so you say server and you put the server IP address, which is the IP address of this machine. So you can actually go into, open up another command prompt and do and find out what the IP address is, which is 10.0.0.6, and this private address, and we put that there. Now what's happened with this is that NS lookup now is pointing to our DNS server. So for example, if I do because we're already that represents that we're already in NS lookup, so we don't need to type NS lookup in the command. We can just type in, for example, news.bbc.co.uk. That's now querying our DNS server, and because it's not configured, it can't find anything. We're going to create a new zone, and we'll just call it. Because this is internal, it doesn't really matter. But to prove that it doesn't already exist, and we're gonna create it, we'll just call it. We call the zone dev web dot com, for example. So if you do look up www, for example, devweb.com, it gives you the DNS server, okay, that's actually done a lookup, and actually that exists. Okay, so that actually exists real live on the internet. That's why it's actually found it. Let me do something which cannot exist. So we'll call it devweb.local. Yeah, so this is internal. We'll just call it local. It doesn't exist and it can't find it. Devweb.local. So we're going to create devweb.local domain name, and it doesn't exist. We've done a lookup. It doesn't exist on the internet. So we're going to add the zone in now as a forward lookup, and we'll also add as a reverse lookup. So we can do a reverse lookup. So we'll add a new zone. So you right click on forward lookup zones, click new zone, and it will bring up the dialog box. Click next. It's going to be a primary zone. Now there's the three types of zones we can create: primary zone, secondary zone, or a subzone. Primary zone is the main zone, and normally any zone created will be in the primary zone. The purpose of secondary zones is if you have two DNS servers, one's the primary server and one's a secondary server. The secondary zones are not main zones, so you want it to replicate from the primary zone. So you'd create a secondary zone which will point to a primary zone. I will show that an example of that in a brief while, but let's create a zone first. So we create a primary zone, click next, and we put the zone. We've already done a lookup on a zone which doesn't exist, which was devweb.local. So we're going to create as a domain name devweb.local. So it could be a domain name that you've registered, or something that you want to use internally. And if you want to use it internally, it doesn't really matter what the domain name is, because it's internal. And ideally you don't want to use an internal. You could create, for example, Microsoft.com, and you could create an internal zone, and it will absolutely work fine internally. But that means you can't get to Microsoft.com using that DNS server anymore. So I wouldn't recommend it for that purpose. And so you create a zone which does not exist. So for example, a domain name ending .local is not available to register at the moment. In a future time it could be, but at the moment it's not. So you could create that. So we're going to create the zone devweb.local. We're going to click next, and we're going to create a new file with this. Yeah. So we're going to leave that default settings. We don't need to change that. Click next. And now do not allow dynamic updates. Allow both secure and non-secure dynamic updates. Now what's the difference between these two items? Dynamic updates are updates or DNS entries which are added automatically. So for example, if you join a machine to a network, and you had Active Directory set up and a domain controller, and you join the machine to the domain, you would not have to add a DNS entry for it. So for example, if you created a workstation and you joined that to the domain, and the workstation was called I don't know, workstation 1, and you added that to the network, and you brought it up and configured it, and it joined the Active Directory domain. If the zone the primary zone was allowed it to add dynamic updates, it will just add the dynamic updates, which means you would not have to manually add the server to the DNS. It will do it automatically for you, and that because it's allowed. For this particular zone, for example, we don't want to allow that. So we say we don't want to allow dynamic updates. And we click next. If you had allowed it, it's absolutely fine. It's not any risk to the network. It just means that the IP addresses can be dynamically updated, and if the system wants to add it, any software wants to add it, it will be allowed to add a DNS entry for it. We click next, and we click finish. Now a domain name exists, devweb.local. So whilst it does exist, there's no records for it. So now we've added the domain name and it exists as a domain name, but there's no records for it. So now the type of, it's the different type of records you can add. So the type of records you can add, we can see from here if you right click within this panel here, so these are the type of records. Now these records are shortcuts where you can just create a zone from here. However, you can actually go to other records and select the record type from there, and all the record types are available from there. So just to take you through some of the basic common type of records, very popular ones are, the first one in the list would be the CNAME. The CNAME is an alias name. So for example, if a domain name already exists elsewhere, it could be on the internet even, or it could be local and you want to point to it, you would create an entry, and I'll create an alias entry right now. So here would be the host name. So let's say you wanted a host name to be pointing to, let's say, Microsoft. So it will become Microsoft.devweb.local. So anything to the left of this, you can add as many periods as you want. With the periods, with the full stops, you can add as many dots and levels as you want. But let's say you added Microsoft, and you wanted to point that to www.microsoft.com. That would be absolutely fine. But normally that would point to a service that another provider was running. So for example, if Microsoft, it could be Microsoft, was running a service and you wanted to point a domain to them, so and you didn't want to call it Microsoft, you can call it my, for want of a better one, my.devweb.local, and that points to Microsoft.com. Microsoft.com. If we add that entry, that's an alias entry. If I put done here, so my is my, so that it will only show the host name because we know that the domain name is dev.local. So all entries will be my.devweb.local. So now, because that entry exists, and we've already pointed from earlier, you remember we pointed that we changed the server to point to our DNS server. We can now type my.devweb.local, and actually looks up the Microsoft, and it will bring it. So if I open up another command prompt here, and if I now ping my.devweb.local, okay. Okay, yeah, the reason why that wouldn't work is because that's not pointing to our server is not pointing to that DNS server. So let me correct that. What we can do is we need to point our workstation or server to point to that name server as well. So the way to do that would be to go to Control Panel and go into Network and Sharing Center. Go into Change Adapter Settings, and we right click and go into Properties, and we go to Internet Protocol version 4 because that's the protocol we're working with, and here we need to add our DNS server to it. So here we're going to say that this server is only going to talk to our DNS server. So at the moment it was picking up automatically from Azure. This is an Azure server, so it's picking up from Azure automatically. But we've now said that we don't want to use that server. We want to use our own server. So that's 10.0.0.6, I believe it was. Let me just quickly look it up. Yeah, 6. So we want to use our DNS server and press OK and OK. This would now work absolutely fine. So if we now go to our and if I up arrow this and get the same thing, it would now ping it because it knows where to look and get a resolution on that domain. That's not working at the moment for some reason. This might be related with an Azure issue. 10.0.0.6. It should in theory work, but because I'm working on this, showing this live, I've not had a time to practice this particular one. My dot okay, I'm not sure why that's not working, but it should work. 10.0.0.6, that's the right IP. But I can see the network is showing as this is a networking issue, not because of DNS or what we've set up. What we've set up is accurate, and that's the way it should work. We'll come back to that. So we've added an alias entry. Like I said, alias entry is only pointing to another domain name. What we'll now do is add an A record. Now A records are, for example, www, if you want to add a www record. So we'll add a www record, and that will point to whatever server that your web server was going to be sitting on. So for the purpose of this, we would want it to be sitting on the same server. So if I get the IP address of this server, 10.0.0.6, so that is correct, 10.0.0.6, so that will be the same, 10.0.0.6. we add that A record in. This was successfully added, and we click done. One thing that we can do here is update associated pointer record. So the pointer record is the reverse entry, which doesn't exist. If I press apply now, it will add that entry in for us. Let's press OK on the warning and press OK again. That's now added an entry into this reverse lookup for us. No, sorry, that's not the entry. Dev Web 01, here it is. Except I think this is incorrect, so I'll have to create a correct zone for it. In fact, that's not added it correctly. I will come back to that in a bit. Let's just do a lookup on this quickly. Let's do an NS lookup. Oh, let's go back to our record, our DNS server, and we do a lookup. So it'll be www.devweb.local, and here you can see that it's actually looked up the domain name 10.0.0.6. Now if we do a ping, it should in theory be able to ping it 10.0.0.6. sorry, no, it'd be www.devweb.local. and as you can see, it is working absolutely correctly, and it's actually found the server and it's pinging it. So if we add a website to this, which I will show you in a different video, uh, the website will work. So this is the DNS part of it. The DNS entry is working fine. Um, and that's the A record added. Let me go and look up the record, the other record that we added, my. So if I do ping my.dev.web.local, okay, that one is not working because I think it can't find the external record because we haven't set up the external lookup correctly, and that's the reason for that. But the internal records will work fine. To proceed on, that's the two types of records: the alias, which are CNAME or alias, it's the same thing. So CNAME records or alias records, and A records. Now A records are host name records. So for example, if you wanted to point a website to www, and these two are most popular records. Of these, the A record is the most popular, and the one that you'll be using is everything is going to be A record. So any machine name is going to be an A record. So if you wanted to on your network add a server workstation 2, you would actually add, if it wasn't dynamically assigned, you would add it manually. So to add it manually would mean you add an A record for workstation 2, workstation 02, and for example, let's say that was going to be on a different IP, 10.0.0. maybe 40, if that's what, if you need to make sure obviously that the IP addresses are not in use. So that will be taken care of, your IP addressing. But whatever the IP address was for the workstation 2, once you add that, that will be you could look it up. You could only ping it if it's correctly on the network, but you could look it up for sure. So workstation 02, if we add that in and press add, now this doesn't actually exist, but if we do a lookup using our tool, if I run CMD, the CMD should now point automatically. The lookup should point to our DNS server because I changed it in the network settings. So as you can see, it points to our DNS server 06 10.0.0.6, and that is absolutely fine because the reason for that is because we now changed it. If we now do a lookup on workstation 2, it will find the IP address we have assigned it, which is 40. I think it just wants to take a few moments before it actually shows up. I'll just copy it from here. Oh, I know what mistake I made. Sorry. We're looking at workstation 02. We have to type the fully qualified domain name, also known as FDQN, FQDN, which is a fully qualified domain name, which is the full name, which is workstation2.dev.web.local. And if we press enter now, it will look it up correctly. And it does 10.0.0.40. And as you can see, 10.0.0.40 is exactly what we put on the DNS server. So if I was to change that to 41, just to for further confirmation, if I do a lookup now, as long as it's refreshed it will now bring up 41. So if I do that now, it will bring up 41 now because we changed it to 41. And there you can see it's 10.0.0.41 because we changed it to 41. But however, if I now try to ping it, workstation, the fully qualified domain name, it will time out because the server doesn't actually exist, even though we've added the fully qualified domain name. If I get that, if I do ping, if I put that, the request will time out because the server doesn't actually exist. Even though we've added the DNS entry for it, it doesn't actually exist on the network. So the ping request, which is an echo request, and sending a request and expecting a request back. So it sends a request, but it can't get a request back because there's no server to respond to that request. So it will time out. So these are the two main types of records we've added. The MX record is what takes care of the email. So as long as you got a mail server, so if you had an MX record, commonly people might put MX1. So if you had a server running on MX1 dot dev web dot local, and if you add that in, and this is quite important, mail server priority. So let's say you were running your own mail server, but you were running also a backup mail server or another mail server secondary should the first one fail. So you put this on 10, and then you could put another one on 20. Even if you had Office 365 and you were running Office 365, so you put Office 365 entries, but they might give you there might be one or two servers for it, or whoever your service provider is, and you're using their mail servers, and they might have a primary server and secondary server. So the secondary server you might want to put, for example, MX2, for example, and here, sorry, that's not a new host, that's an MX record. You have to make sure that the record type is correct. So it'll be mx2.dev.web.local, and we can't put that on 10 because that's the primary is on 10, so we have to put that on 20. It doesn't really matter what the priority levels are. It's very common to put it 10s apart, but you could even put one apart or whatever. As long as the priority is higher, that's what matters. But it's very common to put first one on 10, second one on 20, third one on 30. It's very common to do it that way, so that's the way we will do it. Sorry, this will go in like this. You press OK. Right, okay, so it's an MX record what we are after. So that was an A record I was adding in there, which is good. That we must be careful what the record type we're adding. So the record type is as you can see, is an MX mail exchange record, MX record. So in the fully qualified domain name, we'd put in, and that's exactly what I was saying earlier on, FQDN, which is a fully qualified domain name. So it wants the full name, not just the host name by itself, but the full name, which is the domain name part as well. So it'll be sorry, it won't be workstation. It will be mx2.devweb.local. And if you add that in, the secondary MX record is a part. But what we've done, we put it on the same. So we put that on, for example, 20. And now that is absolutely correct now. It's definitely worth checking to make sure that there's no errors in what we've done today. So because we're working on the MX record is now mx1.devweb.local, and that's on 10, and the second one is mx2.devweb.local, and that's on 20. So as long as your mail servers were there, and these could be on the same server, but potentially this will be on a different server, possibly even a different network, and that's absolutely fine. Your two MX records are there, so what would happen is the email will come and it will try to deliver on the first one, and if it cannot deliver on the first one, it will go to the secondary mail server and try to deliver to that. And if for whatever reason it couldn't deliver to the second one, the mail will just bounce back because it could not deliver. It might be a slight delay in the bounce back, but the mail will eventually bounce back to say we cannot deliver the mail. And that's the three record types we've done so far. We've done an MX record, an A record, and a C name. Now let's look at some other popular records that do exist. Another popular record that does exist is, I mean, these other records are not used very commonly. The AAAA is for IPv6 addressing, but we're not going to be concerned with IPv6 addressing in this video. But the A record, but this record supports both types, IPv6 and IPv4 addressing. But as stated, we're only concerned with IPv4 addressing here. So there's various other, there's the MX record, there's various other records you can add in addition. The next record that we are concerned with is going to be the text record. So these are quite good and important records to add, and this is normally text, which for example, you might put down, if you're adding a service in, a Microsoft Office 365 service, for example, they might actually tell you to put a text record in where to confirm the domain name. So they might tell you to add a record to confirm the domain name, and for this instance, what you would do is, for example, they might tell you that add in something like they might give you a number to add in. So let's for argument's sake take 1100. Yeah, it might be actually several characters. It doesn't really matter what the number is. So what they're going to look for is a text record. So they'll come in and query your DNS server for a record beginning something like this, and they might ask you to put something in here, which might be, the text might be some text which will verify that the domain name belongs to you. That's quite common practice for various services. So if you add, let's say this was what they asked you to do, done. So what we'll do is they'll query your name server looking for that record, a text record with that value. And what they're looking for is a text in it with a certain type of text. And what the idea behind it is that the domain name belongs to you, and you're adding the service to a domain name, and because you've got access to the DNS entries of it, so therefore it's presumed that you've got control and permissions to add items to that domain and for services to run under that domain. So so that's just a verification process that's used, and this text record is used for that purpose as well as many other purposes as well. So this is how to add all the main record types in. The other record types are not very popular, so I'm not going to go through them at the moment. But if we just quickly go in and have another look at the record types. And so the record types and what they're for are clearly stated there. So the three that we done are clearly stated there. A record maps a DNS domain name to a 32-bit IP address. The 32-bit IP address is a version 4 protocol, IPv4, and that's all IPv6 record. And then the next one we've done was the mail exchange record. Again, it gives the full details there. And the text record that we added, the full details of what this purpose, what it's used for, is clearly stated. But the main purpose is to if you wanted to send textual information in the domain name. All the other records are not commonly used records, so therefore going through them we're not going to do in this particular video. One thing that I will show you further is to add a subdomain. So all these entries are within devweb.local. But let's say you wanted to create a new domain name within that and have its own DNS entries and name server. So for example, you had another office, or you just wanted another host name. So what you do here is you create a new domain. We just call it test domain for the moment. Here, then you can now expand that, and that becomes a test domain. Again, there's no MX records. It's completely empty. Like that was completely empty. But the fully qualified domain name of that is testdomain.devweb.local. Now you could add an MX record in here, so this test domain would become its own domain within devweb.local environment. And you could create multiple domain names, so you could continue unlimited, pretty much, of the number of domain names you can have. And you could add a records exactly the same way. What you can do in the main domain, you can do in its subdomains. You can create subdomains under that if you wanted to. So you can create another domain under that, and you can carry on. It's pretty much unlimited. For example, you could create a domain name called testdomain2. And again, what we've done here, that's a sub of that. Or you could create another domain up at the basic level. So this domain would become the fully qualified domain name of this one would be let me bring up my other one. It would be the other command prompt would be test domain 2. Oops, sorry. Actually, let me put that into a notepad. It just makes it a little easier to. So this domain we created here, the fully qualified domain name would be, let's just copy and paste from there if I can. Test domain 2 dot the one above, which is test domain dot one above, which is devweb.local. Similarly, if you had a registered domain name and you wanted to run your own DNS server, so for example, I'm going to take an example of Microsoft here. Let's say you owned Microsoft or any other domain name that you can think of that you owned and you wanted to manage yourself. So what you would do is you create a primary zone for that. So let's just quickly think of a domain. We call it xyz.com. Press next. Create the domain. We won't allow dynamic updates, and so we've got XYZ. So this could be Microsoft.com. It could be, Oracle.com, Oracle.co.uk. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's a domain that's registered. It could be .co.uk or any of the domain names that are currently available. It could be any one of those. So just bear with me on that. That's my workstation messaging. So similarly, let's say you wanted to create subdomain under there. You could create a domain under there, subdomain called Office 1, for example. Or you could call it Office. So this could be domain name that was going to be used by your office, for example. So it would be office.xyz.com. So whilst you can't add anything to the right, because that domain is known as a second level domain, you can't add anything to that. This one is you can add as many domains as you want to the left hand side, so you can continue adding them along. So this one would become office.xyz.com, and you could put and then you could put under there, you could put a record. For example, you might want to call it www because you want to run a web server on it, so you could put www on it at the front, or you could create another domain within that domain, and you could call it Office 2, you know, if you wanted to. Sorry, that's a different way. You need to create a domain name. So new domain, and you could call it Office 2. So here you got two domains. That's office.xyz. Sorry, that's office.xyz.com. This is office2.xyz.com. Just to show you the difference, if I create a subdomain under that, new domain, and call it Office2 because it's the same, just to give you an idea, this one becomes office2.office.xyz.com, whilst this one is office2.xyz.com. So if I delete those and show you the difference between that and that, so this one here becomes office2.office.xyz.com, whereas that one, Office2, becomes office.xyz.com. Now it's very important to remember these two items because you might want to have a category, a subdomain under XYZ that you want to maybe assign to an office or to a category of items, and you want to have multiple domain names under that, and that's fine. So you can have under that, you could create multiple entries. Sorry, you could create multiple entries under there. Office 3, for example. So they're all offices, but you want all your offices under Office, for example. So you create another one. So you want to create it under that, Office 3, you would create it under that. So you create new domain, office3.com. So that will put it with the Office 2. Okay, I think I made a mistake there. Sorry, you have to be careful. You don't need to type the whole thing out. Delete that. I'll create a new domain, and I just need to put Office 3, not the whole domain name. Office 3. So this one we might not want because we want to put it all under Office, so this category is not required. So we come Office 2, Office 3. However, what we might want to do is create another office, not office, but another category. So it could be for example, if you wanted to create an intranet, so if you want your own intranet, so you might put that under XYZ. No, it might not be XYZ because XYZ is your external facing domain name. So you'll probably have separate DNS servers for that. But let's say you had XYZ, and this is your network domain which you created inside your network. In this instance, this is local. This is not accessible over the internet, only on the internal network. So you might, and similarly as you go Office, you might have these domains would normally be under Office, but here you might want to put an entry. You might want to call it another intranet, or whatever name you choose for your intranet. Intranet.web.local. So you create another in this here you create an A record, and it will be, for example, intranet or whatever you wanted to call it, and you have to give it an IP address. So again, like any other record, you have to give it an IP address. So let's say we created a DNS a web server which is on this server. Let's say, for argument's sake, I'm going to put this server's address, which is 10.0.0.6, and we add that host. Now intranet is a fully qualified domain name on the internal network, and it'll be intranet.devweb.local, and that's as long as the web server was there, which I will speak to you on another video on how to create and manage web servers. But that domain name now exists, and because it's in this server, you can actually ping it, and it will ping because it's within this server. So if I now do a ping to intranet.devweb.local, you can see it pings fine, you know, and that would run it if we actually configure a web server, that will work fine, and it will show all the record. The website will work. So here you would type in your browser, for example, you'll type in intranet.devweb.local, and that will display whatever intranet site you set up. It could be a SharePoint, it could be something that you've developed yourself. It's absolutely fine and makes no difference. From a DNS point of view, it makes absolutely no difference. You could be running whatever it's running, as long as it's on the HTTP/HTTPS protocol, it will work fine. But from a DNS point of view, it doesn't really matter what protocol it is. It just matters that it's an IP. It is not concerned with protocol. It's just that it's a networking configuration, a DNS server. Now I will show you how to add a reverse DNS and a reverse lookup. So you have to create a new zone and press next. Press next. So here is asking you, do you want an IPv4 zone or IPv6 zone? If you were using IPv6 addresses, it would be an IPv6 zone. You can quickly press next and you put your reverse zone name there. But because we're using IPv4 only, we press next here. Now our zone is going to be in the private network, and we know our IP address begins 10.0.0.0. So what we put here would be 10 and it would be a reverse lookup that we would be concerned in. So we can actually type it here, 10.0.0, and the remainder part we're not interested in, because you can't type that in, because that's the zone and all the entries are going to go into it, so we don't need that. So we click on that, and in the reverse it does ARPA address, which will be 10.0.0 and whatever. So it could be from 10 right up to 254. The IP address can be in the range within that range. Now we add that zone in, and we want to allow dynamic updates for that, and the zone is now created, which is there. So we want to delete these ones because we're not these were added by default, so we can't delete those. I think they're used by other items. So here we can add a reverse lookup. So here we got a 10.0.0.6, which is this server, but let's say we wanted this to be the server name. Normally it would be the server name that would go in here. So the server name is we can do a browse as well. We can browse is dev01. We select that. It's forward lookup. devweb.local. So sorry, made a slight mistake there. It's devweb01 is okay. It's not a forward lookup. So the domain name, the fully qualified domain name will go there, which is dev01.devweb.local. And now what this means is that this server is now going to be lookup. You can do a reverse lookup on this. So you can do a ns lookup 10.0.0.6. Thank you for watching this training session with us. This was the DNS training session. I look forward to seeing all of you on our next training session. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.